It's time for the children's sermon. Are there any children here with us today? Oh, hello, John and Cyrus. Good to see you guys.
I think we know you.
I know you too. Yes. Any other kids here with us today? On screen or not? All right. Oh, hi, Julia. Good morning.
Hi.
So I'm like acting like I've never seen my kids before because they're in Connecticut with their grandparents, with my parents. So, we haven't seen each other in a few days. Anyway, so kids, what kinds of things have you been told to do by like your parents or by your teachers back when you were in school, or by just kind of the community at large about preventing the spread of COVID? There are some things that you've been told to do, right?
Wear a mask.
Oh, okay. Well, John raised his hand. So John, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, wash those dirty little grimy dirt-filled hands.
All right. Wash your grimy hands. Yes. Okay. Wash your grimy hands. Cyrus mentioned wearing a mask. Julia?
Social distancing.
Social distancing.
I got one. Get the vaccine.
All right. Right. Wait. If you're old enough, but of course, if in a children's sermon, maybe not everybody is old enough. Oh, hi there. Good morning. How are you, Sam? So yeah, like Cyrus and Sam aren't old enough to get the vaccine, but if you're old enough, like John and Julia, sure, get the vaccine. Okay. So, so are you finding yourself able to do those things? Are you kind of doing those things?
I mean, my mask falls off my face half the time because I talk and falls off.
What do we say?
Nose.
That's right. We say nose a lot. So Cyrus is in that in between where the kids' masks are a little too small for him and the adult masks are a little too big for him. So we just say nose, an awful lot, right? So yes. So but you're trying. You're certainly making an effort. Nose. Yeah. So there's that. How's the hand washing going, John?
It's going well.
It's
going pretty well.
I mean, like
about the same as usual. Oh, I have another one.
Oh, what?
Hand sanitizers.
Hand sanitizer. There we go. Okay, using hand sanitizer. All right. Yep. So beginning today in worship, we're going to kind of in-person worship. Obviously, you don't have to wear a mask on Zoom. Kind of crazy. But in-person worship, we're going to be wearing our masks again. So I've got my mask ready for in-person worship. And why are we doing all these things?
To prevent the spread of COVID.
Right, to try and keep each other safe and healthy, right? And it's a way of that we're trying to protect ourselves, right? Because we don't want to get sick, and to protect our neighbors and to show love and concern for our neighbors. Right. Now, here's a crazy thing. In our gospel reading, like the gospel reading, if you could have picked a gospel reading that would be like the worst gospel reading for a Sunday when we're in-person worship, we're wearing our masks again and talking about COVID again a little more than we have been in previous weeks. If you wanted to pick like the worst gospel reading ever for that, it's today's gospel reading. Because what are Jesus' disciples not doing in the gospel reading? Did you hear what they were not doing, Julia?
They weren't washing their hands?
They weren't washing their hands. And when the Pharisees point out to Jesus that they're not washing their hands, you would think that he would say, oh man, you're right. You guys got to wash your hands, right? But instead, he kind of goes off on the Pharisees all about how they're missing the point of like what it means to be religious people. It's really kind of funny because it's like the exact opposite of what, it would be. I would like Jesus to say on this particular Sunday. But having said that, there's a reason Jesus says all that. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that in the next sermon. So I won't say anything more about it now. But we are called as people who want to keep ourselves healthy and be good stewards of our bodies, and also to love our neighbors, to wash our hands and wear our masks and do the things that will help try to help people stay safe around us and keep ourselves safe as well. And certainly to be in prayer for all people who are struggling and continuing to suffer with this disease. So thanks for being part of the children's sermon. Be sure you listen to the next sermon. I'm going to talk a lot more about that hand washing thing. So take care. You can mute yourselves now. It was December 20th, 1996. It was about 9:30 at night. I was a senior in college. It was my 22nd birthday. And I was sitting on the floor of my bedroom in my parents' house, crying. Not just crying, sobbing. Sobbing loudly enough that my mother came into my room to find out what on earth could be wrong with me. So I told her I was crying so hard because the Christmas tree, which had always been decorated in time for my birthday before, wasn't decorated yet. My mother listened to me very kindly. And I'm sure she probably thought in her heart of hearts that I was acting pretty childishly, that I was worked up about something that was really small in the grand scheme of things. And if she did think that in her heart of hearts, she would have been right. After all, what difference did it make if the Christmas tree was decorated in time for my birthday? We didn't decorate the Christmas tree because of my birthday. We decorated it for Jesus' birthday, and we still had 4 days until Christmas Eve. I mean, I was right too. It had always been our tradition to make sure that the Christmas tree was decorated before my birthday. But there was nothing set in stone about that. My mother could have told me what she probably thought, that I was being ridiculous, that I needed to pull myself together, that the heavens wouldn't fall if we decorated the Christmas tree the next day instead of in time for my birthday, that I was 22 years old and it was time for me to grow up. But she didn't say any of those things. Instead, she had my sister come out of her room. She got my dad. She turned on some Christmas carols. And at 9:45, we worked on decorating the Christmas tree together. I don't remember if we got it completely finished that night, but I know that I felt a lot better after that late night tree decorating session. You see, I had been having a tough few months that year. My boyfriend of 3.5 years had broken up with me in October, and I was still very sad about it. Before the devastating breakup, we had been talking about getting married. We had been talking about trying to spend some time with each other's families for the upcoming Christmas as part of our hopes that one day we would be part of each other's families. But then he moved on in his life, away from me, away from my family, away from the things that we had talked about and hoped and planned together, and he left me in his wake. In the fall, I had been looking forward to a different kind of Christmas that year. But when it came to the actual Christmas that we were going to celebrate, I didn't have anything new to look forward to. And all I could hang on to was my traditions, not the way I hoped it would be. I wanted to take refuge in the way that Christmas had always been in my childhood, since I couldn't have the future that I had hoped for. Hence the tears on my birthday about an undecorated Christmas tree. I honestly don't remember if I explained any of that to my mother, or if she just, with the love and compassion and insight of a mother, figured out what hurt and disappointment was behind my tears. But I remember feeling loved and supported and very, very grateful as we had our late night Christmas tree decorating session. Traditions can be useful. They can be important. They can give us a framework for our lives, things to look forward to, things to count on. They can shape our time and our families and our communities in deeply meaningful ways. They can bring us comfort and stability and predictability. They can add to our joy in times of happiness, and they can give us something to hang on to in times of grief or trouble. And yet, in spite of all of the ways in which traditions can be valuable, Jesus is pretty hard on the Pharisees in today's gospel reading, just because they questioned why his disciples weren't keeping a pretty simple tradition, the tradition of washing their hands before eating. Perhaps you cringed when you heard me read that part in the gospel reading and found out that Jesus' disciples weren't washing their hands before they ate. After all, many of us grew up with our parents telling us, make sure that you wash your hands before you sit down at the table. Wash your hands before you eat. We've all certainly spent the last year and a half having the whole world tell us, wash your hands, make sure you wash your hands. Whatever you do, wash your hands. Hand sanitizer has become ubiquitous. Hand washing that has become something that we're encouraged to do multiple times a day and not just when we eat, something that has the power to save lives. It just doesn't seem that shocking that the Pharisees would expect Jesus and his disciples to wash their hands before they ate. It seems like a pretty small ask, a pretty small tradition for the Pharisees to expect Jesus and his disciples to keep, not just for personal hygiene, but also as something that marked them as part of the covenant community of the Jews. After all, the author of the Gospel of Mark tells us that this kind of hygiene around food is one of the things that set the Jews apart as a people in the world in which they lived. He writes as a parenthetical explanation in today's Gospel reading, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles." We know that hand washing is simply one example of good hygiene. Does Jesus have something against hygiene? We know from Mark's explanation in today's gospel that the rules around cleanliness that the Pharisees were insisting on for Jesus and his disciples were part of the traditions that kept the Jews distinctive as a people. Did Jesus have something against tradition? The Pharisees were living in a challenging time, a time when they must have felt that their people's identity as a people was under threat. They lived under Roman oppression and occupation. The Pax Romana under which they lived was a fragile peace indeed, and could only be maintained by careful compromise by the religious leaders. If there was a breach, then there would be crucifixions at the crossroads or armies marching on Jerusalem. Worship at the temple was complicated, with Roman soldiers in the outer courts and money changers in the temple exacting a tax for every sacrifice that was offered. For the Pharisees, who were readers and teachers of the law, who lived out among the people, the safest way for the Jewish people who they had in their care to maintain their identity, to maintain their faithfulness, was a careful and exacting observance of the laws of their people. It's understandable that that was important to them. The Romans might patrol their temple and tax their sacrifices, but the Romans might not worry about the small things, the domestic things, the things that were done in homes and families, how they prepared and ate their food, what they did as they entered their homes, their times of Sabbath rest, and how they did their work. So the Pharisees saw it as their role to maintain and even to police the traditions of their people, clinging to the outward traditions that would mark them as a people distinct from the peoples and races and nations and languages that surrounded them, even as the Roman Empire encroached on their land and threatened to overwhelm them. It doesn't sound unreasonable, does it? So why did Jesus have a problem with what the Pharisees were doing? Why couldn't he just tell his disciples to stop what they were doing and wash their hands? But of course, that's not what he did. Instead, he kind of went off on the Pharisees, saying this: Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition." I'm not sure why the people who put together our lectionary decided not to include the verses that state some of Jesus' specific complaints against the way that religion was being taught by the Pharisees, but I think that it's helpful for us to understand why Jesus was so upset about the Pharisees' emphasis on hand washing. This is part of what isn't included in today's lectionary, verses 9 through 13 of chapter 7 of Mark's Gospel. Then Jesus said to them, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and whoever speaks evil of father or mother must surely die. But you say that if anyone tells father or mother, 'Whatever support you might have had from me is Corban,' that is, an offering to God, then you no longer permit doing anything for a father or mother, thus making void the word of God through your tradition that you have handed on. And you do many things like this. Jesus focuses on one example in his complaint about the Pharisees' keeping of the law, the example of which the Pharisees were themselves or allowing people to neglect the care of their parents because they are too busy giving offerings and keeping the traditions of the people, rather than showing the compassion and living out the obligations and showing the mercy and love that Jesus says that God's law calls them to. Then Jesus goes on to say, and you do many things like this, which implies that his concern about neglect of parents is one example of many of the ways in which the keeping of religious traditions were standing between the people showing the justice and mercy and compassion that is the true religious expression that God desires, as we hear in Isaiah 58. Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin. When we return to our reading for today, we find Jesus focused once again talking about hand washing. But his point is that we are not spiritually defiled or separated from God by what goes into our mouths, but by what comes out of our mouths and by what our actions are. The message is for us to guard ourselves, not with the outward signs of religion, but by guarding our hearts, by questioning the motives for and nature of our words and actions, by seeking goodness and not evil. We have been living in a time of crisis for a long time now. The pandemic, which upended our lives back in March of 2020, and which some of us so unrealistically thought might be over in 6 weeks or a couple of months, has dragged on and on and on, counted not in days or weeks or months, but in years. And after a brief respite early this summer, the pandemic is raging again. And it has disrupted our traditions at a time when we need them most. In a time when fear has abounded, in a time when danger has been real, when grief has been real and overwhelming, when we have needed the comfort of our community and have yearned to be able to gather in ways that are comfortable and familiar. In a time when the world seems to be spinning out of control, it is understandable that we yearn for the predictability of the schedule and routine that has guided our community for years and that has served us well. Because the pandemic hasn't been the only disruptor of our peace in these months, these years. There is a racial reckoning going on in our country that calls into question many of our traditions and institutions, and that even calls for a re-examination of our history in light of so many people's lived experiences, and for a re-examination of our own hearts. There is a climate reckoning going on in our world today, as we hear last summer and this summer about fires raging in the West, about heat waves that claim lives in places that are completely unprepared for soaring temperatures, about storm after storm after storm, battering islands and coasts, and floodwaters rising and washing away homes and communities and lives. These past weeks, and certainly last Thursday, have called us to remember, as it comes to an end, the war in Afghanistan, which has gone on for 20 years and which, prior to last Thursday, claimed the lives of 20,666 American servicemen and women and has injured and maimed thousands more, and has also claimed the lives of probably uncounted numbers of Afghan civilians. And of course, last Thursday, those numbers grew with the ISIS-K terrorist attack at the airport in Kabul, which killed 13 more American service people and at least 95 Afghans, and injured more than 100 Americans and Afghans. The news that surrounds us is worrying and heartbreaking and makes our own daily burdens harder to bear as we face the struggles of our own lives with health concerns and financial concerns and relationship concerns. And even the day in and day out challenges of just keeping our regular lives going, even when things are going well. It is a time when our traditions would really serve us well, would give us something to hang on to. And yet rising COVID numbers are keeping us from a full expression of those cherished traditions, the back to normal some of us long for so much. But instead of just going for it, just going back to the way things were for the sake of the traditions that we love, we are reminded by Jesus' words in our gospel reading for today that our traditions are not the full expression of our faith. The full expression of our faith is found in generosity, in compassion, in mercy, in responsibility, and in love of neighbor. Those are the traditions to which we are called through Jesus' words today and through the biblical record. So in service to the new way that Jesus once called the Pharisees and his disciples to, and that he calls us to through the words of today's gospel reading, we will pass on some of our beloved ways of doing things so that we can continue to love and serve our neighbors and our communities. And as we have learned throughout this challenging time, Jesus continues to be with us, leading us through this time of trial. And Jesus will always be with us, giving us joy in new ways, meeting us in new ways, and surrounding us with the love and mercy and compassion that he calls us to show our neighbors. It is not easy, but it is faithful. And we will, in fact, wash our hands, because that is a way of loving our neighbors too. Amen.